As we start a new series of our online discussions, I'm proud to present our today's speakers. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. First of all, let me introduce General David Petraeus, United States Army four-star general and former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Ambassador John Herbst, director of the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council and former United States ambassador to Ukraine. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum and former Ukraine's prime minister. Thank you all for being with us and for participating in this important online event as we start our new discussions called Fight for Ukraine. This is already the 8th month of Russia's war against Ukraine. Putin has not reached what he desired. He has not accomplished any of his goals, though he enlarged the occupied lands. Ukraine's progress on the battlefield proves that Russia can be defeated. Putin's decision to mobilize additional troops was widely regarded as an act of frustration and despair. Now the Kremlin launches dozens of Iranian military drones to undermine Ukraine's efforts and to win more time for a further offensive. At the same time, Putin continues to blackmail the world with his nuclear threats and massive violence. How to assess the overall situation and Ukraine's progress on the battlefield? What political and military scenarios can be envisaged now? How will Putin react and what should be the international strategy to defeat him? We will discuss these issues today. And I'm glad to start with my questions addressed to General Petraeus. Thank you, sir, for joining our discussion. So my first question is, how do you assess and how do you see this big picture of Ukraine's progress on the battlefield on one hand and international picture of further pressure on Putin? You're welcome.
Well, first of all, it's a privilege to be with you, and it's a special privilege to be with the ambassador and the former prime minister. I think the most important dynamic on the battlefield in Ukraine right now is to recognize that Ukraine, as a result of its total mobilization, now has a military that is larger and also more capable than that of Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine has done a vastly better job at recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and now employing forces than has Russia. And of course, it's been enabled enormously by the more than $18 billion in arms and ammunition provided by the United States, together with over $13 billion in economic assistance from America, as well as from strong support from a number of other NATO countries and Western allies and partners. That has enabled Ukraine to launch that very successful counteroffensive that liberated all of Kharkiv Oblast, is now threatening into Luhansk, and also the slower but still ongoing and methodically continuing offensive to liberate Kherson and the area west of the Dnipro as well. And I think it will continue to enable Ukraine to liberate further parts of the country, including throughout the winter, because the winter is going to be much more difficult for Russia than it is for Ukraine, which is on its own territory with supportive citizenry and everyone engaged in helping those who are on the front lines. Russia is in a situation that is really quite desperate. There's really nothing that Putin can do to reverse the dynamic I have just described. The referendum at gunpoint was meaningless. The annexation of the 4 provinces, again, has no real relevance at the end of the day, as we're already seeing Ukraine take back territory from the 4 provinces that were annexed. And the partial mobilization has turned out to result in more Russian men leaving the country than reporting to the conscription stations, and those who actually do get pulled into uniform generally receive minimal training, if that, and very, very poor equipment and weapons as well. So this is really nothing more than cannon fodder. Yes, tens of thousands of additional soldiers with weapons can create challenges on the battlefield. But the Ukrainian forces are now so much better and so much more capable than the Russian forces that they will continue to retake territory. The only courses of action left to Russia at this point in time are what we see happening. The punishment, essentially, of Ukraine, especially in the wake of the explosion that damaged the Kerch Strait Bridge so severely, using missiles, rockets, and now swarms of Iranian-provided drones that are really quite lethal. They pack about 3 times the explosive force of a 155 millimeter howitzer round, a heavy artillery round. So these are not trivial items, these suicide drones. And they are, of course, being targeted in violation of the law of land warfare, I might add, at civilian infrastructure, trying to take down the electrical generation and transmission infrastructure that supports the civil society of Ukraine, and causing significant damage, trying to terrorize Ukrainian citizens. But the result, of course, is greater resolve, not less. And then the other action that Putin continues to take is to use energy as a weapon to try to weaken the resolve of the NATO unity that we have seen so impressively since 24 February, which I don't think will work either, although the winter will be a tough one. There will be implications and consequences in various respects as a result of the substantially increased price of natural gas, of electricity, and the implications of that for various economies of various countries. But at the end of the day, I think that Europe and the United States and NATO will stay together, will continue to provide the support that Ukraine needs right now, urgently seeking to augment Ukraine's anti-air, anti-ballistic missile, and anti-drone defenses, which are being tested very considerably by these terror attacks by Russian forces, again, using rockets, missiles, and drones, and also continuing to resupply the weapons that are proven to be very decisive on the battlefield, in particular, the multiple launch rocket system that is the wheeled version, the high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, especially with the precision rocket, the GMLRS, the guided missile launch rocket system, which has literally forced Russian headquarters, ammo dumps, fuel depots, barracks, and other logistical support assets to be pushed more than 70 kilometers back from the front lines, which reduces their effectiveness even further, noting that the Russian logistics have been a true Achilles heel for Russia throughout. So that is how I see the current dynamic. I would add one other, having been to the Warsaw Security Forum last week and having engaged with a number of the senior members of the large Ukrainian delegation that was there, my sense that the Ukrainian people will not accept anything less than full liberation of their country. That when they say whole and free, which is, of course, their description of the policy objective, they mean all of their country, not just that seized since 24 February, but that seized in 2014 as well. And I think there's a very strong case that can be made that that is necessary to ensure a viable, a durable security situation when this is all said and done, and also a viable economic situation for Ukraine as well. I'd add as well that the recognition in the West, there's already a lot of planning ongoing in the EU, the United States, the German Marshall Group, on the kind of reconstruction process that will ultimately be needed, and that it will have to be underwritten by a security guarantee. The only one that I can see that would be viable would be a path to NATO membership and an Article 5 collective self-defense guarantee for Ukraine. We were sensitive to Putin's feelings about this in the past. That did not turn out well, and I don't think we should be sensitive about them any longer. We should ensure that there is a durable, again, security agreement, because without that, reconstruction efforts will not succeed. We should recall that in the wake of World War II, it was by no means just the money that the US provided to the countries of Europe that were so destroyed and damaged by the fighting. It was the American security umbrella over all of that that enabled that reconstruction to take place. I'm well ahead of where the situation is on the battlefield, needless to say. There's much very tough fighting, very difficult casualties. And again, this is going to continue for some period of time. But as we look ahead, at some point in time, Russia is going to want to get out from underneath the economic, financial, and personal sanctions that have been imposed by the US and the West. And we need to determine a durable security future for Ukraine. And I think it will be all of those coming together. And frankly, allowing Russia a way out of what has become much worse for them already, 3 to 4 times the losses just in the first 8 months in Ukraine that Russia suffered in some 9 years in Afghanistan. So this is a disastrous situation for Vladimir Putin and the Russian military. I see no way that he can reverse it. The threat of nuclear weapons does not do anything. Even the use of nuclear weapons would dig his hole even deeper than it already is. And US and other countries' leaders have sought to convey to Putin very clearly to his key advisors that the response would be, quote, catastrophic, to use the word that was employed by Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor to President Biden. So that's how I see this particular situation. That's the prospect that I see for the future and the ultimate longer range potential that lies out there as well. But for now, the Ukrainian military is going to continue to liberate its country, and the pace of that will largely be determined by whether Russian forces start to crumble and perhaps in some areas even collapse, surrender, defect, or not. And that will determine, again, how long it takes for Ukraine to achieve its ultimate objectives of being whole and free.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your great remarks and for your support and solidarity with Ukraine, as we are grateful to the United States and the people of the United States for supporting Ukraine in these dark times. Your support is vital for our nation, but also for Europe and for global democracy. Here, let me clarify a few issues. First of all, given what you said, would you share the optimism which is actually was delivered today by senior representatives of Ukraine's intelligence and special services that we may regain more territory up till the end of this year, and we should expect some important military accomplishments done this year? So would you think that this kind of scenario is realistic in military terms? You're welcome.
I do. I think that that is a likely outcome. But again, I would qualify that by always saying it depends. It does depend, in particular, I think, on whether Russian forces can establish viable defensive positions, particularly in the east and southeast, whether or not their units do begin to crumble, as I said. That is a very real possibility, but not guaranteed. And so I would say that I'm quite confident that the Ukrainians will retake more of their territory, liberate more of the areas occupied by Russian forces at present. But the pace of that, the amount that they are able to liberate, will depend both on their continued very impressive campaign design and execution, but also, again, on the durability of Russian forces whose morale we know to be very low, many of whom who question why they're fighting in Ukraine to begin with, a realization that it's the minorities of Russia that are actually on the front lines, and so forth. These dynamics within the Russian ranks, I think, are very important and how they transpire will determine in many respects how successful the Ukrainian forces are, noting that I do believe there will be further liberation. And I would note as well that I don't think that the Ukrainian forces are going to slow their operational tempo in the winter the way that the Russians will have to, both because the Russians' logistics support has been degraded substantially by the inability to put trucks across the Kerch Strait Bridge, by damage to the railway, by the use of, again, these HIMARS precision rockets, the Gimlers, that are pushing the logistics back some 70 kilometers from the front line, and on and on. So I see the challenges for the Russians, who of course are on occupied territory where most people hate them, if not all, and some of them are trying to carry out attacks on them despite the Russian barbaric filtration processes. So life is going to be very hard for them this winter, and their equipment is not very good, including their own individual cold weather equipment. So I think they will have a much tougher winter than will the Ukrainians, who are supported again by Western countries very, very substantially, and who of course are on their own soil. They know what they're fighting for, and the citizenry is there with a warm bowl of soup if they need it, even a bed if they need it, should those soldiers need a break from the front lines. So I think very different scenarios for Ukrainian and Russian soldiers this winter. I do expect progress, but that progress will depend on the factors that I've described.
Sir, you mentioned such a new tool which Putin tries to use in Ukraine, which are drones, Iranian drones. That's a big problem for Ukraine right now, and our Air Force, heroically resist this enormous threat. What do you think? How can we resist this tool? How can we fight back? Do you think there is an option how to deal with this problem, and what should be the international response, including the response with regards to Iran itself? You're welcome.
Well, first and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, the US and the West need to and are working very hard to augment Ukrainian air, missile, and drone defenses. The drones are a particular problem. The truth is that there is no perfect defense for this. What you need is a layered defense and a varied defense. In some cases, you can disable these with electronic warfare. In other cases, you have to identify them and shoot them down. And in other cases, you can even use high-power microwave, although that technology is not yet actually on the battlefield. So there's a lot of scrambling going on to provide what is available. We had problems with this in Iraq and Syria during the fight against the Islamic State, and they didn't employ anywhere near the kind of sophisticated drones with the size of the explosives that the Iranians have provided. So again, a very significant effort going on to augment the defenses. Ukraine is, of course, quite impressively shooting these down in various ways, taking typically down more than 50% of what is shot into your airspace. The problem is that if it's a large number of missiles and drones, some get through and they can be very lethal and very damaging, as tragically we have seen. But that's the effort that is ongoing. And then certainly additional sanctions against Iran, perhaps some other measures can be pursued that one might conceive of to try to prevent those from being transmitted to Russia as well.
And my final question, sir, about the nuclear blackmail of Putin. Recently, you hypothetically said that the United States and its allies would destroy Russia's troops and equipment in Ukraine, as well as sink its Black Sea fleet if Putin uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So this conventional scenario. But do you think if Putin ignites a nuclear scenario, should he personally become a legitimate target for the international response? What would be your opinion?
Well, First of all, what I described on that particular Sunday show in Washington was one option. What I have explained is that there is undoubtedly, in fact, I know there is a range of options that has been developed without getting into specifics with individuals, but they have confirmed there's a range of options. One can imagine that it includes everything from diplomatic, economic, financial, personal sanctions of various types, also perhaps legal measures, and it includes a variety of military options as well. One of those was the one that I mentioned, which would be a US-led operation together with some allies to respond conventionally to a nuclear use in Ukraine to take out, as you noted, Russian forces in Ukraine and also perhaps the Black Sea Fleet. Again, we have the capabilities for all of this. We have quite good intelligence. It is reported, so this would be certainly one of the conceivable options that would be evaluated. Again, certainly no decision's been made. You would never do that until the specific situation is determined. But I think it's very important right now to ensure that Putin knows that this would backfire. This would actually put him in a more dire situation than he is already in because of the response and because, frankly, the use of tactical nuclear weapons has only a tactical effect. It would not change that stark reality, the dynamic I described at the outset, which is so important to appreciate, that Ukraine, because of its very impressive total mobilization and support from the US and West, now has a larger and also more capable military force in Ukraine than does Russia, which is really quite extraordinary when you consider that Ukraine's less than 1/3 the size of Russia and doesn't have many of the commodity and mineral and other blessings that Russia has. So this is a very, very significant development. And again, it is irreversible. And use of tactical nuclear weapons certainly would not reverse it. It would actually make it worse for Putin, and certain actions that focus on him personally, I do think would certainly be among the options considered, although I don't want to get into what a particular choice would be because we don't know what the specific use might be. And again, the real need here, the imperative really, is that the US and others convey very, very clearly to their counterparts in the Kremlin and to Putin how seriously bad an idea this would be, how it would backfire on him. He's in a deep hole already, and this would actually dig it deeper, which is the opposite of what he should be seeking to do, which is to figure out a way to extricate his forces from Ukraine and to stop what is going to be very, very continued bleeding. Noting again that his forces have already lost 3 to 4 times the soldiers in 8 months that they lost in 9 years in a very tough war in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your remarks. And once again, thank you very much for your support of Ukraine. We do appreciate, and we do appreciate that you participate in the discussions of the Kyiv Security Forum. And now, I would like to invite Ambassador John Herbst to answer the questions from our audience. John, I'm really happy to see you, and I have plenty of things to discuss with you, if I may. First of all, let me start from what General Petraeus said. And he mentioned National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who actually said that we are not going to slice the salami in differentiating between possible Russian uses of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. John, what do you think? In your opinion, is the Biden team doing enough to stop and defeat Putin? You're welcome.
On the nuclear question, I think statements made by President Biden at the UN and on the US television program 60 Minutes were very strong. that if Russia were to use weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, the consequences would be devastating. And as General Petraeus said, Jake Sullivan on US TV this past weekend was also very, very strong on this. And that's exactly the right message. And this comes back to the beginning of your question, that the administration is not going to try and differentiate between types of nuclear weapons used by Russia. If they use any nuclear weapons, the response will be very, very sharp. And that's exactly the message to make it less likely that Putin would actually dare to use it. Although I do believe he's using this as a bluff as opposed to an instrument he tends to actually deploy. As for what we could do more, the supplies the United States has provided, especially military, but also economic, have been critical to Ukraine's defense. But I frankly think that response has only been adequate. It has not been nearly as strong as it should be. Ukraine has asked for many weapon systems, most of which, in my judgment, we should have provided, and provided quickly and in ample number. General Petraeus is right to talk about the important impact that the HIMARS have had on the battlefield. They stopped the slow, grinding Russian offensive in Donbass that was making progress for literally about 2 months, starting in April, before we sent the HIMARS, which arrived on the battlefield either in late June or early July. Their impact was immediate. By the end of July, the Russian offensive had ceased in Donbass, and shortly thereafter, Ukraine began its successful counteroffensive. But
and of course, the heavy artillery played a very significant role in that as well. But at that point in time, there were over 100 155 millimeter howitzer
correct
that were provided with. Now we're talking over 850,000 rounds, which has been very, very literally decisive. Again, I'd argue in the Donbass in particular. Over.
No, I agree completely with that. But we know that the Ukrainians requested the longer range artillery and the HIMARS beginning in the middle of March. And had we sent it earlier, I have no doubt that the Russian offensive in Donbass might have been a failure from the very beginning. And we've seen a general hesitancy on the part of the administration to fulfill other weapons requests. Sometimes we send the weapons after we say no. HIMARS is the longer range HIMARS, the TOWs, the MLRSs are examples, but other things we still have not sent. Like aircraft, like tanks. And these things, I believe, if we provided, speed up Ukraine's counteroffensive in the east and in the south. And we all have a great interest in making sure Putin is defeated in Ukraine. And the faster he is defeated, the less likely it is that he would ultimately succeed, because he is hoping to buy time so that his hydrocarbon blockade of Europe will have an impact, so his possible resumption of the grain embargo will have impact, and so that things might change domestically in the United States and other Western countries. So our policy has been, as I say, in my judgment, adequate. I believe it should be stronger. It's possible the Russian military will collapse even without us providing more weapon support. But the likelihood of a collapse, the likelihood of a faster victory goes way up if we provided more weapon systems.
Thank you, John. My next question will be about the upcoming G20 summit in November in Indonesia, in Bali. In your opinion, because this is an important global issue that has a direct impact upon Ukraine's situation and Russia's war against Ukraine. In your opinion, what difference can make an apparent summit between President Biden and China's chairman Xi with regards to Russia's war, if any? You're welcome.
I believe in diplomatic engagement, so I have no objections to a summit between Biden and Xi. And of course, Moscow's war in Ukraine would be one important subject at such a summit. But so would the matter of Chinese belligerent policy in the South and East China Seas, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan, China's genocide of Uyghurs. So it would not just be Russia and Ukraine that would come up on that agenda. My sense is that Xi might have some partnership remorse from that meeting he had with Putin in early February, and that very, very expansive joint statement that suggested much greater cooperation between China and Russia. Xi has tried to distance himself a little bit from Putin's outrageous behavior in Ukraine, the attack on civilians, and also his failures. And in a sense, Putin wound up apologizing to Xi at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in Samarkand a few weeks back. And China has been pretty careful about avoiding falling into sanctions territory by helping Russia escape sanctions. Bottom line, I think that China is sending messages to Russia, for example, on the nuclear question, do not use nukes, and is encouraging Putin in the right direction, but only so far, only so far. And of course, we all noticed Xi's belligerent tone on the Taiwan question at the Chinese Party conference early this week. One last point here. I believe Putin's failures in Ukraine thus far have chastened Xi's views on Taiwan. While he's talking belligerently, I think he understands that given his problems dealing with 25-year-old or 30-year-old American technology in Ukraine, he'd have a much greater problem across the Taiwan Straits.
Thank you, Ambassador. And my final question will be about Russia. Ukraine's parliament has adopted a resolution, an important resolution, to recognize the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which was occupied by Russian in the mid of 90s. So the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, condemned the genocide which was done by, committed by the Russians against the Chechen people. So, in your opinion, and from the United States perspective, how do you see the overall political processes in Russia these days? And do you have this feeling of that something may trigger the same process as it was during the Soviet times when the Soviet Union collapsed? So what's your take? How do you assess the situation in Russia, the state of affairs in Russia today? You're welcome.
There's no question that Putin's authoritarian policies and corruption of the Putin regime has put a big brake on the Russian economy. Putin enjoyed an economic renaissance his first 7 or 8 years in power because of the rising carbon prices at that time. But even as oil was still 12, the Russian economy was growing at the rate of like 1% coming out of the global economic recession. It's continued and been exacerbated by the sanctions following Moscow's seizure of Crimea and hybrid war in Donbass, and the greater sanctions imposed as a result of his massive invasion this past February. In addition to that, of course, his war in Ukraine thus far has been a spectacular failure, and we've seen fissures in Russian society and in the Putin regime over the past several months. As General Petraeus mentioned, Russian draft-age men have headed for the exits once they began the mobilization a few weeks ago. Fewer people have been enlisted in the Russian army than have fled the country since the mobilization began. We've seen criticism of mobilization by senior regime figures. We've seen fighting among senior regime figures. Prigozhin, the Wagner head, Putin's so-called cook, Kadyrov have been attacking Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the lead general in Russia, as they talk about the war in Ukraine. It's clear that tensions within Russia are growing. The war is contributing to that. And over time, that will have an impact on Putin's ability to conduct the war. And it may well lead to failure of the army, implosion of the army. Even if the U.S. aid does not increase. We can't predict this will happen, but we can see the dangers. Very few people, actually almost no one, predicted the demise of the Soviet Union, even as we saw the warning signs beginning in the the early 80s. I think the same is true today. The point is only Russians will determine Russia's future, but we have a major ability to thwart Putin's aggressive policies. The place to do that is in Ukraine, and by enhancing the assistance we're already providing Ukrainians at the present point.
I do, thank you. And John, please pass my best regards and gratitude to the team of the Atlantic Council, our good friends and partners. And now I turn to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Arseny, look, what we have here today and what we feel together with you, that Russia's massive attack against Ukraine has been expected for months. However, Ukraine still lacks the necessary air defense systems to protect itself. In your opinion, why does it take so long to meet these, in my opinion, obvious needs? You're welcome.
Well, definitely it's up to the military folks to decide what is more needed for the Ukrainian military. But in my humble opinion, there are two, I would say, key pillars of this particular stuff. The first one is that the Ukrainian R&D in terms of anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems was heavily underfunded on the one hand. On the other hand, we have to be proactive instead of being reactive. It was obvious that Russia is to launch a barrage of Soviet-style missiles and high-precision missiles. So it was largely expected that Russia is to launch drones, different drones, including Iran drones. So we have to be prepared in advance. So I strongly believe what General Petraeus said, that a semi-layer system of anti-aircraft and anti-missile system is needed in Ukraine. And this definitely combines with a high necessity of fighter jets for Ukraine. And I strongly believe that in the nearest future, our allies is to decide whether to supply fighter jets to Ukraine. I mean NATO standards fighter jets like F-16, because Ukraine is right now completely interoperable with the NATO standards. So we have to switch from the Soviet-style, completely outdated Russian equipment to new modernized equipment, which heavily supports us on the battlefield. And I want to be very clear, saying thank you in person, both to General Petraeus and to Ambassador Herbst, in your person, to the entire American people and to your administration, in the way how you support Ukrainians. And this is really impressive. And let me tell you that this is the best investment in our and your security. And once again, I am very grateful. So in terms of anti-aircraft systems, we need it on the fast track. What am I concerned about? I am really concerned about, for example, Iran and North Korea. And the reason why is very simple. Could you just imagine Iran, which is heavily under sanctions imposed by the free world, managed to produce and to supply to Russia thousands of suicidal drones, thousands. The same goes with the North Korea. Just a few days ago, they tested a ballistic missile with the range of 1,200 miles, if I'm not mistaken, which is capable of delivering nukes. So both these countries are under sanctions. And despite these, they managed to produce this kind of deadly weapon. This is a wake-up call for the entire free world, and we have to realize that something wrong with the sanction regime. Something is definitely wrong. Going back to the anti-aircraft and anti-missile system, it is urgently that we need to get it, and I believe that both our allies and domestically Ukraine have to speed up shipment and production, because we have capabilities, domestic capabilities in Ukraine, so we can manage this.
Thank you. And actually, you mentioned this deal between Russia and Iran, and this is a matter of great interest and great danger for the international community. What was the price of that deal? I mean, what Russia delivered to Iran in terms of this military exchange?
Here is the thing, Danilo. It's not just between Russia and Iran. It is worse. What has emerged already in this world? A new axis of evil. And this axis of evil has Russia. This axis of evil has Iran. This axis of evil has North Korea. But besides this axis of evil have so-called tarnished supporters, under the table supporters. So where China stands? And it's clear that after this Communist Party, which is ongoing right now, Congress, it is clear that China is too belligerent against the West. And China is on the wrong side of the aisle. For example, in terms of not supporting UN resolution that condemned the referendum, an illegal referendum. The same goes with India. So we have to take into consideration that we are living in a completely different world, and this world needs to get a clear response to the challenges that have emerged. And the new challenge is that maybe we are to have a bipolar world, and we are right now in this bipolar world: democracy against autocracy.
There is no other option as to win in this fight for democracy and freedom in the world and for Ukraine, since any kind of defeat will lead to some kind of unpredictable consequences for our planet. And actually about these scenarios, Mr. Prime Minister, if we can tell this briefly, what kind of scenarios do you envisage now? What do you feel about the overall situation here in Ukraine and in our fight with the Russian aggressor? You're welcome.
You just gave the answer. There is no other option on the global table rather than to prevail, rather than to win for Ukraine and for the entire free world. I do understand that this is to be the war of attrition, because some folks tell that this is to end in a few weeks or in a few months. I don't see this kind of scenario. But my take, my gut feeling is that Ukraine is to prevail. The biggest threat I see, except the military one, that is right now on the battlefield, on the battleground. And once again, I do commend Ukrainian military and those who support Ukrainian men and women in the uniform. But the problem is that Russia decided actually to switch to another type. That's not another type of war, to incline and to switch on new tools of this war. Which is to target civilian targets, infrastructure targets, energy facilities. So, and I expect that the primary target for Russia is actually to trigger a humanitarian crisis and humanitarian disaster in Ukraine. An entire blackouts, and to target both energy company, utility companies, railroads, and actually to undermine the basics of the living in Ukraine. And for this particular reason, we definitely need more weapons. We definitely need the supply of anti-aircraft system. But what is needed more? We need to revamp and actually to repair Ukrainian electricity grids and the electricity system and Ukrainian generation system. The same goes with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is under full control of Russia. So I believe that the UN is to do its utmost in order to help Ukraine actually to demilitarize this nuclear power plant. So in the end, look, the Gallup just presented the poll. Were the Ukrainians ready to fight? And these numbers are astonishing. 70% of Ukrainians strongly believe that we will win and we will restore our entire territorial integrity. And that's where Ukraine stands, and that's what we stand for. So my final message is that we will win, we will prevail. We, it means Ukraine and the entire free world.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I would like to thank you all, General Petraeus, Ambassador Herbst, for your great contribution, for your remarks. It's a war and it's a genocide which Russia commits against Ukrainians. But this is what Arseny said, and I fully share this sense. Today, I was in downtown Kyiv. I talked to my friends, to my colleagues. I saw people in the streets, and there is, there is a lot of things in the air, but there is a great sense of invincible spirit. And this is what we would like to send you back from Kyiv, from the Kyiv Security Forum. We will prevail together with you. I do appreciate your participation. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you. God save Ukraine and God bless the United States.
Forces and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you.